If you thought I was done, I do not think you were paying attention. Welcome to NintenDeen Today. So that direct, huh? That was certainly something. You know, it feels like it's the same cycle we go through every single time. You know, it gets to that time of year where people are starting to expect the Nintendo Direct. They want to figure out what they're going to be buying soon. Whether it's earlier in the year. Okay. We'll pause real quick. Yeah, this is my face. This is what we're doing now. This is my show. It's called NintenDeen Today. You're going to have to get used to this. I'm going to have to get used to it too. You're going to have to get used to it. Or you can just turn the camera off and listen to me yap on like normally. But that being said, back to the topic. So we all know the cycle, right? It's like it gets to that time of year where people are expecting to find out what games they're going to be playing on their Nintendo console. Usually the rumors start off, it's always a general direct with always the biggest announcements. Everybody gets overhyped. They psych themselves out. The content creators are not helping. They're psyching them out even more. Predictions are ridiculous, through the roof. But it's like deep down in the back of your mind, you know, like the timing wise, it's probably going to be either an indie showcase or a partner direct. In this case, it turns out to be a partner direct, which I think for many people was very expected, just based off of the pattern of the way things have been flowing recently. The problem is, even when we end up finding out it's a partner direct, the hype just continues to build up. Unrealistic expectations. Everybody's expecting just like the most massive announcements you can imagine. This is the same thing we see every single time. And then no matter what the games are, they generally do not live up to the hype. And that might not necessarily be the third-party publisher's fault. It might not necessarily be Nintendo's fault. But it seems like it's always the same cycle over and over and over again. Now, in the case of this particular showcase that we just saw, there were some good games. I mean, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is coming out. Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade might be the best game on the Nintendo Switch 2 right now. Orbitals looks really cool, and that's a Switch 2 exclusive, at least for now. That 80s anime style, it's very unique. But the gameplay on that title is something that we've seen quite a bit recently, especially with games like It Takes Two and Split Fiction and the like. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Those are very fun games for a reason. And I'm sure this one's going to be enjoyable as well, but you need a little bit more than that, right? And you know, there were some big games that were also being announced for the Nintendo Switch 2 that were going to launch with the PS5 and the PC and the Xbox. Resident Evil's a big one. Granted, we already knew about it prior to this Direct, and the footage they had to show in this Direct was obviously very much censored to gear towards a family-friendly environment, because Nintendo. But still, this is going to be a game that launches on the same day as all of the other big players. And we will most likely see the same thing with the next Final Fantasy game. And while that's good and all, it doesn't solve one of the major issues that always seems to follow along when you're playing on a Nintendo console. Even if the game is not an old port of something that was created 5 to 10 years ago, it's still going to be massively inferior compared to anywhere else you want to play it. And the problem is, generally speaking, when you're playing it on those other consoles, fairly quickly, you could expect some kind of a price drop, a discount. But when the games are on the Nintendo hardware, they take a little bit longer to drop in price. I do wonder how much of that is because of Nintendo's fees to have stuff sold on their eShop, but it could also just be that they know that Nintendo fans tend to spend a lot more on software in general, so they're like, we can sneak this up a little bit higher for a while longer. I'm not sure, but it just seems to be a regular pattern. But then again, this is a Nintendo console, right? You're not expecting that many people to actually go out and want to purchase these third-party titles on there. The Direct closed off with massive Bethesda announcements, and you're looking at like 10-year-old games that they're going to be coming out full price on this console, and they're going to be pretty inferior compared to anywhere else that you can play them, which is business as usual. It's funny because one of the announcements that I'm seeing people most excited about is the Bomberman collection. You know, that's the kind of stuff that you expect would flourish with the Nintendo fandom, and seemingly it's getting a very positive reaction. It was even shadow dropped. I believe it's available today. But the reality is, through most of this Direct, you're either seeing stuff that you already knew about, or you're finding out about a bunch of things that are available for both the Switch 1 and the Switch 2, which, again, you're trying to get this feeling of this new console, new generation, and it's still a lot of talk about the previous stuff, making this very much feel like a pro console more than a sequel console. And while there were some interesting things like that one game where that dinosaur was chasing you in Tokyo, was it Tokyo Scramble, I think it was called? And there was that other game where, I don't even remember what it was called, but it was like a little girl with the big guy, and they're just going around pointing at things and puzzle solving with battle elements. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but you know what I'm talking about. I'll put the title up on the screen while I'm yapping. But at the end of the day, I think there are two main problems with all of this. It's that this is, number one, it's a third-party Direct, which is, it's a Nintendo console, right? The first-party games, that's what people want to see. Or at least they want to see stuff that's kind of adjacent to like the Nintendo environment, even if it is a third-party game. Which I don't think we saw much of that, or at least nothing new from that. And then the other problem is, even if it is third-party, it feels very catered towards a Japanese audience. Right, like you had the big Bethesda close-off that I was saying, but I mean, I don't think people were really excited to see Bethesda show up as the big announcement at the very end of it. Right, I think people were really hoping for something like Expedition 33. I heard a lot of people that were hoping about Halo, Call of Duty. You know, a lot of those mainstream Western titles that you think people are just really jumping over each other to get onto the Switch 2, and it's just not coming. And it's the stuff that people have been hyping themselves about as well. But for the most part, this Partner Direct, it felt like a Nintendo Partner Direct. It didn't feel like a next generation. It felt like the same thing as usual. And perhaps that's going to evolve over time. You know, first, you're going to go through a few years where you're mostly going to just be seeing old ports on the Nintendo Switch 2. But in fairness, that's what you're getting on the first party end as well. It's mostly just games that were Switch 1 games getting up-resed a little bit. And if you're lucky, the frame rate goes up as well too. And that just might be what people have to deal with for a short while. The thing is, with the Direct catering towards a Japanese audience, it doesn't really surprise me that much. See, because with the whole Nintendo Switch 2, since the launch of the console, there's been a lot of catering towards the Japanese audience. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the biggest issues that was seen by the shareholders in this most recent quarterly from a few days ago. Right, we officially got word that the Nintendo Switch 2 has sold through, which means sold obviously to customers, 15 million units as of the end of last year. In that same time frame, they shipped out just over 17 million units. But what's really interesting is paying attention to where everything is being sold. So we know in Japan, for example, those consoles, they're pretty much moving as soon as they hit the shelves. They shipped out, I believe, 4.7 million units, and likely 4.7 million units got sold to customers immediately. And there's a bit of a gap between what the Famitsu numbers show, which is the data that's collected through the Japanese retailers, as well as the numbers that are shown in Japan shipped from the Nintendo financials, and that gap in numbers is very likely what's made up through the My Nintendo store. So the Nintendo Switch 2 sold 15 million units, and about 4.7 million of those are Japanese customers, which implies that roughly 1 in every 3 people that are buying the Nintendo Switch 2 are located in Japan. Now, Japanese customers are still Nintendo fans at the end of the day. It's not like they're worth less. The problem is, their console is actually worth less, because Nintendo, as we all know, subsidized the Switch 2 for the Japanese audience. Obviously, the math fluctuates depending on how much the yen is worth and the US dollar is worth at any given time. But to put us in the simplest of terms, every 4 consoles that are sold in Japan are really worth only 3 elsewhere. So if that big of a portion of the entirety of the buyers of the Nintendo Switch 2 are located in Japan, that's problematic. And that's a very big reason why, even though the Nintendo Switch 2 ends up being the fastest selling console of 2025 and still having the fastest 7 months of any console in history, despite that, profits are not as high as the shareholders would like. And you saw it in the market. For the first time in over a year, the Nintendo stock value did not jump upwards after the financials. As a matter of fact, it slid downwards, and it continued to slide downwards for a couple of days, including today as the market negatively reacted to this Partner Direct. The biggest headlines that were coming out were about Oblivion, Elden Scrolls, which is good. I'm glad the Nintendo Switch 2 is getting that. But, it's not like that big, massive announcement that you're looking for a Nintendo Switch 2. It's not what the shareholders and the investors are looking for, unfortunately for Nintendo. Now, mind you, I'm not really making this stuff up on my own. These are conversations that you can see directly taken from the Nintendo financials, where there was a Q&A session following it. It's already been uploaded on Nintendo's website, where you can find all of the investor relations reports. At the time of recording, they only have it uploaded in Japanese, but we have the power of Google Translate, so we can actually figure out what people are thinking. During the second question, one of the shareholders asked President Furukawa the explanation that the full-year consolidated earnings forecast would not be changed, considering factors such as changes in regional sales ratios of hardware. However, what was the reason for not changing the expected sales volume of hardware and software based on the results of the year-end sales season? Also, given that domestic hardware sales exceeded expectations, is it correct to understand that overseas sales fell below expectations? President Furukawa answers saying, "As you understand regarding the hardware sales value, domestic sales exceeded expectations while overseas sales were somewhat weaker than our expectations. The Switch 2 is not doing very well outside of Japan. It's something that we had all kind of seen coming." See, the problem is many of us have been kind of caught up in this battle about what's considered a good amount of sales for the Nintendo Switch 2 and what's considered poor. And the reality is, I don't determine that. Neither do you. The only people that determine that are Nintendo. And Nintendo is aiming to please shareholders, not us. And the reality is, if you're in a corporate meeting and the president of a corporation suggests that something was weaker than expectations, even if he says slightly weaker, that's not a good sign. And that's a very big reason why the market has reacted the way it has. The reality is the investors want to see success outside of Japan, not inside of Japan. I mean, if you saw the Circana data for what was sold through in the United States, it suggests that the sold-through rate, what was actually sold to customers in America, was only 4.4 million. That's fewer units than what was sold in Japan. In the holiday season specifically, Japan outsold the USA. That's very rare, and that's not a good thing. In fact, if you look back at it historically, what was the last time this happened? Might have been the 3DS. And the 3DS is one of the lowest performing handheld consoles in Nintendo history, and it took a massive price drop to achieve the numbers that it got to. Now, to an extent, you might be wondering, why is it that the Nintendo Switch 2 has performed better in Japan than it has in the States? Well, obviously, we know that they have the subsidized console over there, so they took the economy's consideration and the strength of the yen, or rather, lack of strength of the yen, while pricing their system over there. They didn't really consider that everywhere else. They figured that everybody else would pick up the slack and subsidize those consoles for the Japanese customers. But another part of the reason why Nintendo is really struggling right now is because their software sales are really not that good. As a matter of fact, after Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza let off the console in the beginning, the only games that seem to have come out and been worth highlighting on the recent financials was Pokemon and Kirby. And those are very Japanese-centric games. They're games that do much better with Japanese audiences than everywhere else. And again, those are not my words. Those are the words of Furukawa. In answer number 3, he says, "We believe that the reason why domestic hardware sales have performed better than expected is that while the initial momentum of the Switch 2 hardware continues, the release of new titles such as Pokemon Legends ZA, Nintendo Switch 2 Edition, and Kirby's Air Rider during the year-end sales season prompted a relatively larger number of existing Switch owners to upgrade to the Switch 2 compared to the overseas markets." Those are Japanese-centric games, and the reason they're doing as well as they are is because they are much more catered towards the Japanese audiences. Now, I do think it's worth checking out this Q&A session on your own. I'm going to wait for Nintendo to directly translate and upload it on their website. It should be coming up tonight. Historically, they've uploaded on the Friday after their financials come up on a Tuesday. But you know what? Let's take a second and focus on those software sales. Let's take Kirby, for example. People really seem to be celebrating that one. Now, the first thing that I think is worth pointing out is that these are actually sell-in numbers for the software. No, I'm not kidding. Look at the page. It says 4.25 million units sold by Donkey Kong Bonanza, as well as the 8.41 for Pokemon Legends ZA on the Switch 1, and obviously Mario Kart and the Pokemon Legends on the Switch 2. Those same numbers are the ones that we see on the report when we talk about the games that have reached 1 million units sold. Now, obviously, this always happens. They bring up sell-in, I talk about how that's shipped and not sold, and people argue that that's what Nintendo always reports. Except that's not entirely true. In the previous quarterly, back in November, Nintendo suggested that Donkey Kong Bonanza had sold in, which is shipped, 3.6 million units. Or I think it was 3.5 million units, actually. Turns out, later on in a presentation that was shared, Furukawa suggests that the sold-through number for Donkey Kong Bonanza was only 2.6 million units. Generally speaking, when it's in a financial report and they're talking about sell-in numbers, those are shipped. But if there's like a tweet that comes out, for example, that tells you that there's 1 million players, that's when it's sold through. And it's not uncommon for companies to share a sell-through number, including Nintendo back on this same quarterly the year after the Nintendo Switch 1 came out. See, back in 2018, they were a lot more proud about the sell-through numbers that they had. This is, again, could all be found on the Nintendo IR page, where Furukawa himself is sharing the data. Next, let's talk about software in the first year of the Nintendo Switch. Sell-through has already exceeded 6 million units for 3 separate game titles. 6 million units for 3 separate games. This is all in 2017 in the launch year of the Switch. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, obviously, 7.5 million units. This is sell-through. Donkey Kong Bonanza, the flagship title for the Nintendo Switch 2, sold in, shipped, is only at 4.5 million units. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, 6.5 million units sold through. Mario Kart World has more, but it was also bundled for $50. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was bought by everybody full price at $60, so it's kind of hard to really compare them one-to-one. But my money is on the fact that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe in 2017 probably would have outperformed Mario Kart World if it was just up for sale by itself, not bundled in, especially if they were charging $80 for it. Obviously, you got Mario Odyssey, which has a sell-through of more than 7.5 million units as well. Again, completely eclipsing what Donkey Kong Bonanza did in less time, mind you, because it came out in the end of October. These are flagship consoles. These are the system sellers that we talk about that the Switch 2 completely lacks. Mario Kart World is french fries. And then, of course, you have Splatoon by itself sell through 4.5 million. So those are all titles that have sold more than anything that you've seen on the Switch 2, obviously, except for Mario Kart World. Now, in fairness, Pokemon Legends ZA has done very well, but a vast majority of the units for that game were sold on the Nintendo Switch 1. And again, we don't even know the sell-through data for that, we're just provided the ship numbers. Now, you might be wondering, where's Hyrule Warriors? Where's Metroid? Right, those are the big titles that came out for the holiday season in addition to Kirby. Why is it that Kirby did so much better? You know, you could say that Kirby is a better quality title, right? It's Sakurai. It's amazing. The time and effort that he put into that title made it stand out amongst the rest. And you know, that's a very adorable thought, almost as adorable as the pink puffball himself. But once again, when you break down the numbers, it's kind of obvious why Kirby did better. Now, first off, in Hyrule Warriors' case, they actually have sold 1 million units. But we find that out through Koei Tecmo's financials, not in Nintendo's. Because in Japan, it's not a game that's actually published by Nintendo. It's considered third party. In the West, it's considered first party. So they did suggest that Hyrule Warriors has sold 1 million copies. Kirby sits around 1.7 million. And if this random dude over here is to be believed, apparently Metroid has sold 1 million units if you combine the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 versions. But obviously you don't make it onto the financials for Nintendo unless you reach 1 million units on your own, being either the Switch 1 or the Switch 2 version. And we know, based off of sales data everywhere, that the Switch 2's version is doing much better than the Switch 1 version for Metroid, because it is an enthusiast game and enthusiasts tend to upgrade their consoles first. Now, here's the fun part. If you look at the Famitsu data for what was sold from Metroid in Japan, it's very low. Like, we're talking probably fewer than 100,000 units. If you're lucky, it might be over 50,000 units if you're combining both the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 version. So you're potentially looking at almost 900,000, if not more, units sold outside of Japan. That's massive. In the case of Hyrule Warriors, it's probably closer to 200,000 to 300,000 depending on the digital splits. But either way, that would imply that outside of Japan, it sold 750,000 units. Now, on the other hand, we know that Kirby basically won. It did better than both of these games. If we're talking about just over 1 million for Hyrule Warriors and Metroid, you're looking at close to 2 million for Kirby. And for this reason, a lot of people are considering Hyrule Warriors and Metroid as flops, and if not flops, definitely underperforming titles, while they're saying that Kirby is punching above its weight. But then you look into the financials and you realize the reason why Kirby is punching above its weight is because of the Japanese market. More than half of all Kirby Air Riders copies were sold in Japan. That's a lot. And I think it's really telling about where the Switch 2 is succeeding. So we know that the hardware outperformed their expectations in Japan, and we know that the games that cater to the Japanese audience more performed better, those being Pokemon and Kirby. And we also know that games sold in Japan, consoles sold in Japan, everything is so much cheaper over there, and it doesn't look good for Nintendo's financials if all of those numbers are coming from Japan for that reason specifically. But now it's seeming very likely that games that cater more towards Japanese audiences are going to be performing much better on the Nintendo Switch 2 if things continue as they are. Right, if you just do some basic math, you find out that Metroid Prime outsold Kirby in everywhere outside of Japan, and Hyrule Warriors is pretty close. And if we're considering Metroid Prime and Hyrule Warriors as underperforming titles, that means Kirby, outside of Japan, is also underperforming. And add on to that, you see what Donkey Kong Bananza is managing in comparison to what Odyssey and Breath of the Wild managed, and that's the flagship title of the Nintendo Switch 2. And all of this is made so much worse because we only know the sell-in numbers for these games. We don't even know how many people are actually buying them. So while the sell-in numbers are good for Nintendo from a financial sense, from a Nintendo gaming community sense, there's not many people that resonate with these titles. If you're talking about fewer than 1 million people for Metroid, Hyrule Warriors, and Kirby, all over the Western audiences, it's no wonder why it feels like these games are very niche over here. Because they are actually very niche over here. There's not that many people buying them. There's not that many people interested in spending the money on them. And it's the same case with the Nintendo Switch 2. The Nintendo Switch 2, in circulation in the Americas, has over 1 million units just that were expected to be sold in the holiday season. Again, this is based off of taking the Circana data and looking at what was shipped to the Americas. And when you consider that the United States makes up at least 85 to 90% of the Americas itself, that's 4.4 million units out of 6 million, maybe 5 out of 6 million, give or take, that was actually sold to customers. These are numbers that were expected to sell in the West, specifically in the Americas. And then we already know what the numbers look like in Europe. In most places, they either slightly undersold the Switch 1 or they slightly oversold the Switch 1 in 2017. And if we're using our own benchmarks to determine what's considered a success and a failure, you might say that the Switch 2 is on a good track. But we don't decide what's considered good and what's considered bad for the Nintendo Switch 2. The only people that can determine that is Nintendo. And the only people that Nintendo are trying to please are the shareholders. And the shareholders have lost all confidence in Nintendo based off the number of sales that the hardware and especially the software has seen. And all of that, and I haven't even fully delved into the software sales numbers and what you would have expected versus what's actually being sold. I haven't delved into how poor third parties are doing. They're doing very bad on the Nintendo Switch 2, which is to be expected because it's a Nintendo console, to be fair. But that was part of the whole thing with the Switch 2. It was going to be stronger and it was going to support third-party titles and everybody was going to eat it right up and buy it. And that's part of the reason why it was so expensive. But it's just not working out the way Nintendo planned. And the digital splits are not looking good either. No matter how much they're trying to push into a digital console with the game keycards, the Nintendo fandom is still very much interested in physical. They're interested in first-party titles. And unfortunately, you have a Nintendo Switch 2 that came out, which is more expensive in the West than it should be, is focusing way more on third parties than flagship first-party titles, and is very much ruining the physical market that we Nintendo fans tend to love. And it has very much 100% been reflected in the sales of the Nintendo Switch 2, where it has performed below expectations. And if Nintendo says the Switch 2 has performed below expectations, and the shareholders are losing confidence in the company, that means 2025 was not as good as Nintendo expected. It might not be time to say the Switch 2 failed yet, but we'll have to see where this goes next. In any case, that's all I got for tonight. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you all on the next one.